Hello and welcome everyone, this is Minoo at Anglo-Link. I often get asked about the difference between will and would. So in this lesson, we're going to compare the usage of will and would in different contexts. Some of you have asked to have PDFs of my YouTube lessons. If you'd like access to the Anglo-Link PDF library, please use the link in the description box. Now let's begin our lesson by looking at the 5 common uses of will. The first use of will is for future possibility. For example, perhaps we will meet again. Make sure when you speak that you use the contraction, perhaps we'll meet again. The second use of will is for future prediction. For example, I think she'll be pleased with the results. The third use of will is for making an instant decision, usually in a dialogue. For example, someone says, I'm too tired to cook tonight. Don't worry, I'll put something together. Notice that again, the contraction is the most appropriate in a conversation. The fourth use of will is for promising. For example, I assure you this will never happen again. In this situation, we usually use the full form because we want to stress this will never happen again or I will never do this again. For these 4 functions, would never replaces will, except in the reported or indirect speech. For example, we would say, he reassured me that that would never happen again. And the 5th use of will is for making a request. For example, will you open the window, please? Notice that this is an informal request. In this case, you can use would instead of will to make it a more formal request. Would you open the window, please? So that's the first use of would. Now let's look at the second use of would. It's again in the context of politeness. For example, instead of saying I want, like I want a glass of water, you should say I'd like or even I'd love a glass of water. Instead of I recommend, you could say I'd recommend. Or instead of I prefer, you could say I'd prefer or even I'd rather. Make sure you use the contraction when you speak. And the third use of would is an alternative to the expression used to for habits and repetitive actions in the past. For example, you can say, when I was growing up, we would go to Spain every summer. That means we used to go to Spain every summer. Now make sure you don't use would for a fact in the past. For example, don't say, when I was growing up, we would live in a flat. In this situation, you can only use used to. When I was growing up, we used to live in a flat. Right, let's now look at will and would in conditional sentences. This is where things can start to get a little confusing. In conditional 1, we use will. For example, if I have time tonight, I will finish my assignment. There is a high probability that you will have time. Now, in conditional 2 sentences, where the situation is hypothetical, we use would. If I had time tonight, I would finish my assignment. This means that you have a low probability to have time tonight. We also use would in the third conditional, which is the impossible conditional. If I had had time last night, I would have finished my assignment. So let's look at a couple of common mistakes that happen with these conditional sentences. The first one is starting with a conditional 1 if clause and then using would in the consequence clause. For example, saying, if I have time tonight, I would finish my assignment. Because you're mixing the 2 conditionals, your listener will be confused. Is it likely that you will have time tonight, or is it unlikely? So if you say, if I have time tonight, which means it is likely, it is probable that you will have time tonight, make sure you will finish with will. I will finish my assignment. The second mistake is to use will or would in the if clause, after if. For example, saying, if I will have time tonight, I will finish my assignment. Make sure you don't use will in the first part. Or you may make the mistake of saying, if I would have time tonight, I would finish my assignment. Again, do not use would after if. The correct second conditional sentence is, if I had time tonight, I would finish my assignment. But as always, there is one exception, and that is if you want to be polite when you're using a conditional one sentence. For example, you can say to someone who's visiting you, if you would like to take a seat, I'll let my colleague know you're here. Or you can say, if you'll follow me please, I'll show you around the premises. Right, that brings us to the end of this lesson. For more practice with will and would, you can watch this lesson. And remember to check out my complete online course at Anglo-Link.com. And as always, please subscribe, like, and allow notifications. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you soon in my next lesson. Goodbye for now.